Hello, my name is Carly Glowacki, and I'm joined by Blake Gallulo, Victoria Saporito, Morgan DeBelle Duplan, and Sean Ramini. Our guests today on Media Matrix are Professor Kate O'Gara of the Political Science Department and Joe Alicastro and Rick Falco of the School of Communications here at Sacred Heart. Today we will be discussing the role of terrorism in the media. Hello, professors. How are you all this morning?
Fine, thank you.
I'm well, thank you.
Great. Well, thanks again for joining us today. So tell us, how and why do terrorist groups form, say ISIS, for example?
Right, so if we specifically want to talk about ISIS, ISIS really began as al-Qaeda in Iraq and by a man named Zarqawi, who actually went to Afghanistan to get support from Osama bin Laden. I believe Joe has had some experience in Afghanistan, so I may let you sort of pick up on that thread.
Okay, and I would go back actually a little bit earlier than that, and it kind of ties the whole thing together with our country as well. I was in Afghanistan in 1990 a couple of times, and in Pakistan, which at that time had the largest refugee population in the world. This was all caused by the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan. The United States started supplying tremendous millions and millions of dollars of weaponry to the Mujahideen who were fighting against the Russians. Our goal, of course, was to kick the Russians out of Afghanistan. Saudi Arabia was also supplying a tremendous amount of money to the Mujahideen. In fact, President Reagan called them the freedom fighters. As soon as the Russians were out, so were we. We just basically walked away from it. And that caused a tremendous amount of resentment, which I saw in my subsequent trip to Afghanistan, which was during the Civil War between the Mujahideen factions. And ultimately, that is what I think led to the formation of al-Qaeda and bin Laden. He had a safe haven in Afghanistan. He was able to build his organization as small as it was compared to ISIS. But it was effective, and unfortunately, we all saw that on 9/11, and you probably want to pick up with that.
Well, obviously, what it gave us, him, the capacity to do is to organize an assault that changed the nature of the world, and particularly how we live our lives. Everything related to the media, culture, you name it, everything changed after September 11th. And I think what has happened is that they also realized the potential of how you utilize the media, how you utilize particularly, the media for creating propaganda, for recruitment and the like, and it's kind of followed through to where we are now with ISIS and where we see what they are capable of doing, not just in the Middle East, but more recently what's happened in Europe.
Okay. Hi, Professor. Again, thank you for joining us today. My question for you is, if ISIS is so concerned about controlling Europe because of the poor borders, are we really involved, and if so, how?
Okay, so it really should, why should we be worried about ISIS, or why should we be concerned about things like that are happening? I mean, if you look just at the chaos that has happened in Syria over the last several years, there's been a real impact of that on our allies in Europe, on our allies in the Middle East, the refugee crisis, all of those things. Something happening within Syria, which seems like it's very far away, has really impacted the sort of the order of the world in many ways. As ISIS also controlled more territory, that in it alone became a little bit more of a recruitment tool to say, here, we have already established this caliphate, we've established this territory, you can come and live in this utopia, and that's part of the propaganda that makes it seem more attractive. So part of the goal, as different from al-Qaeda's goal, part of the goal was to establish this territory first. And so the more they're able to recruit and use this territory that they have gained as an asset, that makes it much more dangerous for the rest of us, particularly if you're looking at Europe.
Yeah, and what they've been able to do is they've been able to flourish in anarchy. You can go back to the American invasion in Iraq under President George W. Bush, and Secretary Powell, Colin Powell, famously said, if you break it, you own it. Well, we broke it, but we didn't claim ownership of it entirely, and so we unleashed in a way a power that was right there under the surface. Because a part of this, we have a tendency to view things through the American filter. And actually what this is much more of a power struggle between the two main factions of Islam. And they're surrogate wars that are being fought here. Just like during the Cold War, the Soviet Union would support one group or one faction and we would support the other. Well, the same thing is going on all throughout the Middle East right now, where Saudi Arabia, which represents the Sunni faction of Islam, is supporting factions in certain countries, and Iran is supporting Shia factions in other countries like Hezbollah or the factions that are aligned with them. And so these are all underlying causes. It's a very, very complicated situation. And the biggest mistake you could make is to look at it with a simplistic view.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we have to look at is the change created also by the Arab Spring and how media, particularly media of individuals, was used not only to make that move forward, but what happened after so-called revolution took place. The structural elements that allow government to work weren't in place. And I think when we look at what's evolved, particularly in relationship to Syria, which has really been the conflict that is like catapulted things so out of proportion, is when the conflict first began, Western leaders did not want to intervene and eliminate Assad. They did not want to do that because of the political ramifications of their own countries. So they let it go forward and get worse and worse and worse and worse until it got so out of proportion, it allows an organization like ISIS to come and swoop in, take advantage, as Joe said, of the anarchy and move it to a level where they gain land, people, money, and consolidate that power where it escalates beyond the borders of Syria and Iraq.
Okay, so my question is also for Professor O'Gara. On the topic of refugees, why do you think U.S. citizens have become somewhat worried about border security when it comes to allowing these refugees into the country? And I ask because I know Donald Trump is very concerned with border security and keeping Muslims out of the country. And do you think his ideas of keeping Muslims out has any merit, especially when issues are related to domestic terrorism?
Okay, it's a loaded question. Okay, so a couple things. One is that the Syrian refugees, the number of refugees, the United States has, since September 11th, had about 784,000 refugees, not from Syria. 784,000 refugees have been admitted into the country. Of those 784,000, only 3 have ever had any connection whatsoever to terrorism. So that's, can't do the math fast enough, but that's less than a half a percentage. So that's one thing, one issue. And the process of being admitted as a refugee is a pretty complicated process. It takes 18 to 24 months. You have to be on a United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees list to be able to even start the vetting process. You're interviewed by the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees. You are interviewed by Homeland Security. You're interviewed by FBI. You are interviewed by the State Department. People who know you are also interviewed, neighbors in a refugee camp, whoever it is, as much research as they can do before you even get to that point where you are admitted. So the concern about refugees being, it's a different concern than in Europe where you have borders. They're not strict borders between countries where you have free travel. So they have a different concern than we do. We are able to have that process happen in a different way. There are some concerns about the visa waiver program that we have with several other countries. So if you're living in France right now, you wanted to come to the United States for vacation, you just have to fill out an electronic form. We have a visa waiver program with France. They're on a list so that you can come. If you are a French citizen, you can come to the United States, you have a French passport, you won't really face the same scrutiny you would if you were a refugee. So one challenge is that the attackers in Paris, the attackers in Brussels, they had Belgian passports, they had French passports. So that is a little bit more of a concern than refugees. And then your last point about whether or not, when presidential candidates say things like we should not be admitting Muslims, or when Ted Cruz talks about patrolling Muslim neighborhoods, it's also a little bit of a misunderstanding of who in the United States has been radicalized. 40% of those who have been radicalized were recent converts to Islam. 25% of terrorist plots that have been foiled in the United States were foiled through family tips or concerns from imams or from the Muslim community. So when you alienate the Muslim community by saying things like that, you make it more difficult to have cooperation. And that's the best way to combat radicalism within any community, is to have cooperation of the local community. So those are some real concerns.
Yeah, I think there's the comparison between Europe and the United States on this issue is not a good one. It's very, very difficult. The Muslim population in Europe has been there for a longer period of time. They're marginalized in ways that the Muslim community is not marginalized here, and ghettoized in Europe the way they're not here, where the Muslim community is much more integrated in the United States with the larger population. Most people who have come, 99.9% of the Muslims who came to this country for the same reason that just about every one of you came here with your ancestors, which was for economic opportunity and freedom. So they share the values. Secondarily, if you go back and look historically at terrorist attacks that have occurred in the United States, with the exception of 9/11, most of them are homegrown and not related at all to Islam. So there's that as well. And we have taken in a minuscule number of refugees by comparison to Europe. Germany took in 1 million alone. Angela Merkel agreed to a million refugees, and I think our numbers are like under 1,000 from the current Syrian refugee crisis. So there's that. And just one other thing on this, I think we should all be proud that just yesterday our governor was given the John F. Kennedy Award for standing up and allowing the first Syrian refugee family to come into Connecticut, when other governors said that they would ban all refugees.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that we should think about, too, in terms of this relationship between Europe and the U.S. One, we have this enormous ocean that people have to go and get across, where I think the flow, as we are seeing, particularly going from Turkey into Greece into Europe, is much easier. The other thing is that this is a political year where it's very easy to inflame your constituency by saying these things that get out a vote, make talk go beyond rational, pragmatic, logical thinking, and just inflame the public in a way that gets you votes at the expense of what we need to do as a people. And I think we're seeing that over and over again with both Mr. Trump and Mr. Cruz in terms of some of the things that they have put forth to do, all of which I think are not only the wrong things to do, but some of them, quite honestly, are illegal. You can't do them. They're not allowed.
Right. And just to piggyback to what you had mentioned, Joe, about the different neighborhoods, that's another interesting point about if you look at neighborhoods in the United States. So, for example, I have a neighbor who is Egyptian, who is Muslim. I have a neighbor who is Syrian, who's Muslim. So do I live in a Muslim neighborhood? Is that a neighborhood that you're talking about patrolling? Like, we are much more integrated. And with the exception of Minneapolis, which has a significant Somali population that came in the mid-90s after the civil war in Somalia, and they did, just like immigrant communities often do, they will form neighborhoods where you know someone, this is where I'm going to live. So other than that exception, we don't really have Muslim neighborhoods in the first place, because we have very integrated communities.
Yeah, I mean, even in New York, if you go in Brooklyn along Atlantic Avenue, where you have a lot of Muslim neighborhoods, if you will, or I shouldn't even say Muslim, Arabic neighborhoods, what you find out in a place like New York is at some point, everybody has to ride the subway, and you're rubbing shoulders with somebody who's Hasidic sitting on one side of you, somebody who's a Muslim in the center, and somebody who's a Christian on the right, and an atheist to the right of them. So this is our society, and I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind is when inflammatory statements are spewed by politicians, we have to ask ourselves, is that an American value? You know, because that's what we don't want to give up here. We don't want to give up American values. We don't want to give up the Constitution. We don't want to give up who we are as a people. It's one thing to protect the country from terrorism. It's another thing to give up our democratic values.
And to take that a step further, is there strength in diversity? And we have to realize the importance of that. Okay, our country has been built on that, and that diversity is the thing that propels us, I think, forward as a society and gives us all of the components that make up who we are.
Thank you. Very interesting. So I think it's important to touch on the idea of terrorism in the media. And so we know that these terrorist organizations such as ISIS are using tools such as YouTube and, most importantly, Twitter. And we know that Twitter is actively taking down these tweets and these accounts, but just as fast as they're taking them down, they're coming back up. So what do you feel is the responsibility of these social media networks and corporations to thwart these actions and to prevent further recruiting?
That's a great question. It is really interesting. Just this morning, there was an article in the New York Times about Facebook, and Facebook's selling weapons on Facebook that, particularly in Libya, there were a lot of weapons caches that were unguarded, and those were captured by all sorts of people, and so you're not allowed to sell weapons on Facebook, just as a side note. But there are these communities and individuals in Libya who are selling weapons, and I'm talking about some pretty significant weapons that they're selling on Facebook. So until the New York Times reached out to Facebook and said, look, we found these websites where they're selling weapons, and that's whenever Facebook took down 6 of the 7 websites that they had found. So it's not, part of the challenge is, well, first of all, we live in a free society, right? We have free speech. We want to be able to have access to information. If you were researching ISIS, you want to be able to actually find information, right? So you don't necessarily want that to be censored. At the same time, really troubling, horrific propaganda that's on YouTube is a concern. Twitter accounts are a concern. But with the policies of those organizations like YouTube, it's not unless they're reported that YouTube will take them down. Facebook really has a similar issue. So, and they don't immediately, automatically take them down. They will review their policies, see if it fits with, if it is violating those policies before they take them down. So it is a real challenge where that line is, because you do want to continue, even things like encrypted phones, all of those issues. Where is that line?
Social media is here, and it's not going to go away. And the fact of the matter is, even if we were able to patrol everything on Facebook and everything on YouTube, they'll eventually create all of their own networks, and then we'll have no control over that. So ultimately, there's an expression that, you don't cure a fever by attacking just the fever. What were the underlying causes that caused the fever? And that's what we really have to look at. We have to look at a much, much bigger picture here. How do we eliminate poverty? How do we eliminate ignorance? How do we, you mentioned it earlier before, how do we enlist the Muslim community to be a part of the solution as opposed to the problem? These are all approaches that I think are much more sensible. And in terms of Facebook and YouTube and the whole idea of free speech, yes, we live in a free society and we believe strongly in free speech. It's one of our most important values, and it's an amendment to our Constitution. But what we do need to do is we need to also remember, even though we have free speech, it is illegal to yell fire in a crowded theater. And that's what social media is being used for in this case. And so, yes, it's perfectly within the rights of these social media corporations to take down these posts.
And I think the other thing we have to think about is the numbers. think of how many people use Facebook and Twitter. How do you patrol that amount? Think of it. It defies logic in terms of being able to do that on a daily basis. The other thing I think that we realize is that what social media gives the larger public is a voice that they would not have had before. And I'll use an example that's not just Islam. There was a minister in Florida who had a congregation, I think, of 6 people who decided that he was going to burn the Koran in front of his church one day. Okay? This is just an offbeat guy who decided to do this. Within hours of him saying that, it went worldwide so that we had people in countries that had never heard of this guy protesting, going into violent demonstrations because of the immediacy that our technology has given us. Okay? Now, on one hand, there's negative components related to that. On the other hand, if you look at the Arab Spring, there are positive components. Where you draw the line is a very difficult thing to do. Because remember, in the Arab Spring, most of our Western journalists were denied access to these situations, and the only way we were getting information was Joe Blow with his iPhone taking pictures that there are actually 100,000 people here protesting. Okay, and how do we address that, as opposed to ISIS creating like these propaganda things which they send out, and quite honestly, as soon as it's closed down, Anonymous, as you probably know, has been going after ISIS to close down the networks that they're creating. Another one is opened almost immediately. It's a difficult thing to address.
The other interesting thing is to another way to combat that without necessarily censorship would be to fill that space with a different narrative. So groups, there's an individual in Minnesota who has created a cartoon called Average Muhammad. So and he tries to kind of promote the idea that that's not really what Islam is all about. The hashtag Not in My Name organization, hashtag My Jihad, trying to reclaim the word jihad, which really means struggle. So my jihad is to be a better parent. Things like that. Even recently, there was in October, I don't know if you know this, but in October, Special Forces went into Iraq and they rescued 70 Kurdish prisoners. When they did that, there was video of it as it happened, and it really was sort of like a Zero Dark 30, if anybody's seen that movie. It was really like that, only in real time, live time, and it was actual events. And so one of the Kurdish prisoners actually released that online. And having that, first of all, not come from the government releasing it, but having Kurdish prisoners release it, that gives you a different narrative. It shows you exactly what things are really like under ISIS, or within ISIS territory, rather than their propaganda. It was the United States working with others and rescuing people. Like it was kind of a win-win in many ways. And so filling that space with a different narrative is another way to sort of counterbalance that what ISIS has been doing.
Yeah, quite simply, the word Islam comes from the word salam, which means peace.
How effective do you believe YouTube videos and social media accounts are on recruiting terrorists? And do you believe there's a direct link between watching a propaganda video and actually carrying out an attack?
And the action. The behavioral analysis unit at the FBI basically has sort of a timeline of what they think really happens. And so it often starts, really there are internal factors and external factors. So an external factor might be something like if you were living in Egypt, you might see every night Palestinians being killed by Israelis. You might see stories about Bosnian Muslims in Bosnia being massacred. You see things like that, and so those are external factors that become a grievance. And then from there, you may say, well, you know what, I really need to do something about this, and so you may start to just research, well, what's happening, and that may lead you to those videos. And then there are also internal factors of where are you in your life? Are you in a period of transition? Are you feeling a part of your physical community? If you're not feeling so much connected to your physical community, you may be more likely to search for an online community. So when you start to search, if all you're doing in the beginning is, I'm curious about what happened in Bosnia, so you start looking at that, and that may make you more and more angry. And then as you explore that, if it coincides with other challenges maybe that are going on in your life, you may be more drawn to this online community. And they're so good at targeting an individual and keeping up with that individual 24/7. So imagine having somebody who always answers your text, always answer, immediately, and giving you sort of that personal attention. If you think of it this way, if you were following a celebrity and all of a sudden that celebrity actually reaches out to you personally, sends you a message, it's sort of that sort of a feeling and a connection that's one of the ways that they really sort of do that. So I'm not sure I'd say that someone watches a YouTube video and they say, okay, I want to go out and commit an act of terror. It's a combination of a lot of factors. There are many people who might watch that YouTube video and nothing happens. And that's what happens to the majority of people. So it's a more complicated than a direct link.
Yeah, another internal factor in certain parts of the world, like the northwest of Pakistan, around the area of Peshawar, and across the border in the Hindu Kush, in Taliban-controlled areas, the only education a child will get is in a madrasa, which is absolutely indoctrinating those children in radical Islam. And that is an internal factor that's very, very difficult to manage, and we certainly can't manage it from the outside, not when the Pakistani government is allowing it to happen.
Well, we certainly have covered a lot today, but I guess to kind of wrap up and encompass a lot that we've talked about, I know Professor Alicastro mentioned before, like most of these, ISIS terror attacks are not occurring in the country. Al-Qaeda's 9/11 was kind of the biggest thing that's happened. But the San Bernardino was connected to, ISIS took responsibility, not necessarily the U.S. citizen, but his wife was radicalized when she was, overseas and came back and kind of brought that here. So what can we do as an American people, as an American society, to be more aware of, the fact that something like this could happen again and, be proactive or prepared for these terrorist events, because it's something that's not going to go away, unfortunately. So
I think we have to understand that the first biggest shockwave when something like this happens is in the Islamic community itself. 99.9% of the Muslims who live in this country know immediately when an event like this happens that it affects them
right.
in a way that is much stronger than it affects us, because their community is being marginalized by the one radical
Right.
amidst them. And so, again, we've touched on this before, but I think what we need to do is we need to make it absolutely clear. I don't know if any of you remember, where was President Obama's first foreign speech?
I couldn't give you the answer, quite honestly.
It was in Egypt. And it was in Egypt, and he
I'd
went
hope so.
there to start a new chapter in the relationship between the United States and Muslim countries around the world. Now, has it all worked out peachy keen? No. But the point is, I think that if you are open and you tell people of good faith that we're with you, you're going to get a lot more cooperation from that community, and they will marginalize their own people.
I think the other thing we have to realize is that the technology is having an impact in ways we never thought would happen before. And I think what we have to realize is how that impacts on the psyche of individuals who are feeling left out and can be manipulated or make a decision to move to, I'm not just looking at this, to an act. Okay? The problem that I think we're also discovering, particularly with social media and with the ability of what it gives us and also access to technology in terms of the computer, is that we're actually becoming more isolated in many respects than we are connected to our community, particularly those who have been disenfranchised, who then kind of cluster in front of their computer with their online friends, as opposed to sitting in a room and voicing something where they would get feedback. It was interesting. A number of organizations have been focusing on bullying related to online capabilities. And you will do things online that you would never do in front of the person. And I think the technology has gotten to a point where somebody who is isolated and sitting in the rooms, it gives organizations, whether they're to the right, to the left, Islamic, Christian, it doesn't matter where it is, the opportunity to enter a door that under any other circumstances would probably be closed or they would get resistance from.
And another issue that we haven't even touched upon, but I'll open the can of worms and say, for God's sake, let's have some sensible laws when it comes to assault weapons in the United States.
I don't know if I want to touch that one, but I will say, just to sort of reassure you, because I know it is challenging growing up. Really, what you have grown up with, and what you have seen, and how the world has changed, even in the last several months, with Paris attacks, with Brussels attacks, it does increase anxiety, but. Your chances are really insignificant, really tiny, tiny, tiny. And the National Counterterrorism Center, actually, if it makes you feel better, has a video you can watch that will give you little tips. But the most important tip, I would say, is, and this is a tip regardless of what danger you might be concerned about, and that's just be aware of your surroundings. That's really one of the biggest recommendations, is just pay attention. And I know that we haven't really talked about this either, but you were just talking about the importance of not really alienating the Muslim community, and that's the community that is most affected as soon as, if there is an attack. In that same way, when I say pay attention, I mean pay attention to behaviors, pay attention to something that is unique or different, not pay attention to anyone based on religion or appearance, but pay attention to other factors. Pay attention to a backpack left in a classroom, which, think about how many times you may have left your backpack in a classroom. It's not a big deal, but pay attention to that. Little things like that, and I promise that 99.999% of the time you are safe. So it's all right.
And I'd just like to bring up the point also that we keep saying Islam, but there's been a number of terrorist attacks that have gone on that people don't, Timothy McVeigh, who blew up a building, was not Islamic. Just recently, we had an individual deciding he wanted to go into an abortion clinic and shoot a whole bunch of people. These are also terrorist acts. Okay, and they're perpetuated and made into something because people are connecting online through some kind of source of media, that they get to the point where it's okay to make this next step to create a violent act. And that's where we are.
Yeah, Osama bin Laden did not invent terrorism. I grew up in the 60s, and the Weathermen bombed a block away from where I lived in Greenwich Village. Let's see, there was also the FALN attack at Francis Tavern in Lower Manhattan. And if you go back in history, I am sure that the British were writing about those American revolutionary terrorists who fired from behind trees and didn't fight fairly in our Revolutionary War. So it's a long, long history, and it doesn't begin with bin Laden.
Well, that's it for today. Once again, I'm Carly, joined by Blake, Victoria, Morgan, Sean, and Professors Alicastro, O'Gara, and Falco. We thank you for joining us today and hope you've enjoyed the show.